In my last video, I discussed the topic of fascism, specifically the ideology and its quote-unquote philosophy. In it, I concluded that since fascism has many variations, each looking and performing differently from the other, that fascism isn't exactly an ideology, because it is a belief system that inherently values power and violence over doctrine and philosophy, and for that reason, fascism is an ideology of contradiction because it is always willing to deviate and contradict itself if it means it will get more power and influence. However, following the release of that video and upon further research into fascism, I recognized that my initial conclusion, which reduced fascism to merely a manifestation of violence and a thirst for power, was significantly misguided. Although I accurately pinpointed the pragmatic and adaptable characteristics of fascism, asserting that it lacks any further depth was a major oversight in my analysis. Fascism, akin to communism, encompasses numerous variants that are never entirely identical. Although these variations of communism differ in approach based on the country and environmental context, they all adhere to a unified objective and, to some degree, share the same philosophical foundation. Their aim is to fulfill the aspirations and visions of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, such as the abolition of capitalism, prioritization of material conditions, among others. Similarly, fascism and its various forms align with this perspective. In fact, Mussolini himself even said this, quote, "Each nation will have its fascism, that is, a fascism adapted to the particular situation of that specific people. There is not and there will never be a fascism to be exported in standardized forms." As the Duce himself said, fascism is not to be exported as a uniform model, but will instead tailor itself to the unique circumstances of the particular populace. I also deduced that given fascism's varied appearance across nations, there lacks a core set of doctrines or a philosophical foundation underpinning the ideology. When contrasted with the variants of communism, it becomes considerably more challenging to pinpoint a unified goal or belief that unifies these diverse forms into a cohesive fascist framework. Despite significant doctrinal differences, a clear pattern emerges among all fascist variations, including the rejection of liberal democracy and Marxism, ultranationalism, militarism, revolutionary rhetoric, anti-capitalism, the cult of personality surrounding the leader, among others. If we were to adhere to my prior conclusion that fascism was merely an embodiment of brute force and pragmatism, such a pattern would be non-existent. Evidently, there is an underlying philosophy and doctrine that binds them together on these fronts. And this will be the primary goal of this follow-up, to pinpoint the core doctrine and philosophy of fascism and, ultimately, to furnish it with an accurate definition. Because at the end of the day, fascism is more complex and in-depth than I originally thought, and it is finding this common thread among all fascist variations that will finally give us a means to properly identify it. Despite acknowledging flaws in my previous conclusion, I still strongly encourage everyone to view the preceding video on this topic. It delves into the flexibility and pragmatism of fascism extensively, and I will connect it with the content of this video. I highly recommend checking it out, it remains an engaging watch. Without further ado, we should start off with the basics. What did the original fascists read? In this segment, my focus will primarily be on Fascist Italy and Nazi Germany. As compared to other variations of fascism, Mussolini and Hitler were able to more deeply develop their ideologies and had the opportunity to implement them in practice. Consequently, Italian fascism and National Socialism were significantly more intellectually evolved. Mussolini and Hitler were both avid readers, and the literature they engaged with greatly influenced the evolution of their respective ideologies. However, their sources of inspiration differed markedly. Mussolini was predominantly influenced by Friedrich Nietzsche, Gustave Le Bon, and George Sorel. Hitler, conversely, was deeply influenced by the intense pan-German nationalism and anti-Semitism of figures such as George von Schönerer, Houston Stewart Chamberlain, and Karl Lueger. But there is one interesting thing to note here. The overwhelming majority of writers and philosophers who inspired some aspects of fascism never really had much to do with the ideology or even suffered personally from it. Writers who attacked and criticized liberal democracy fall especially under this category. I previously highlighted Gustave Le Bon as a significant influence on Mussolini. Mussolini frequently referenced Le Bon's work, The Crowd, a study of the popular mind, which offers a skeptical examination of how passions ignite and merge within a mass of people, rendering them vulnerable to manipulation. The fascists adopted this analysis as a kind of blueprint. However, it is important to note that Le Bon himself was never a fascist, nor did he endorse the ideology. Another notable example is the Italian political scientist Gaetano Mosca. Mosca had an influence on fascism with his analysis of the inevitable circulation of elites even within democracies. But despite this, Mosca was one of the few senators who actually stood up to Mussolini in 1921, and he was one of the signatories of the Anti-Fascist Manifesto of 1925. In the context of National Socialism, Oswald Spengler and his work, The Decline of the West, played a crucial role in shaping Nazism. Spengler theorized that cultures undergo life cycles akin to organisms, transitioning from a heroic and creative age of culture to a decadent age of civilization. In his second volume, Spengler proposed that a form of heroic Caesarism could potentially rescue Germany, advocating for a revitalization of the nation without changing its social structure. It is evident why Spengler's ideas would resonate with the Nazis. However, despite their admiration for his work, Spengler consistently refrained from supporting National Socialism. In 1932, likely with Hitler in mind, Spengler wrote, quote, "Enthusiasm is a dangerous burden on the road of politics. The pathfinder must be a hero, not a heroic teener. Fascism frequently draws inspiration from the works of individuals who either did not endorse their ideology or were outright opposed to it. The figures who inspire various fascist movements differ significantly. As mentioned in the previous video, there is no singular quote-unquote father of fascism, akin to Karl Marx's role in communism or John Locke's in liberalism. This diversity contributes to the complexity of tracing fascism's intellectual origins. Robert Paxton, whose work serves as a primary source for both this and the previous video, put it in the best way possible. Quote, "The intellectual and cultural critics who are sometimes considered the creators of fascism actually account better for the space made available for fascism than they do fascism itself. They explain most directly the weakness of fascism's rivals, the previously ascendant bourgeois liberalism and the powerful reformist socialism of pre-1914 Europe. Concrete choices and actions were necessary before fascism could come into being, exploit the weakness, and occupy those spaces." Now, I am aware that some of you, particularly those more versed in the subject, will highlight the notable figures such as Giovanni Gentile and George Sorel, regarded as the two most pivotal individuals in the development of fascism. So let's go over them for a brief minute. Giovanni Gentile, I concede, was the principal philosopher responsible for providing fascism with an intellectual underpinning, with Mussolini himself acknowledging him as the philosopher of fascism. However, there are two significant considerations to bear in mind here. Firstly, it's important to note that all of Gentile's major contributions to the philosophy of fascism were developed years after the March on Rome and Mussolini's ascent to power. This indicates that the fascists had already established a form of unified goal before they possessed an explicit intellectual foundation for their movement. Secondly, Recalling our earlier conclusion that each nation will manifest its own unique form of fascism, a review of Gentile's seminal work, Origins and Doctrine of Fascism, reveals that his discourse is almost exclusively centered on Italy and its socio-economic context. Rather than proposing a universal theory applicable to all variants of fascism, Gentile's writings primarily provide the intellectual groundwork for Italian fascism, not a bigger picture. Concerning George Sorel, it is accurate to state that his doctrine and concept of national syndicalism had a significant impact on Mussolini. Indeed, many scholars regard Sorelian syndicalism as a precursor to fascism. Even Gentile acknowledged that the ideological and political methods of Italian fascism were derived from Sorel's ideas. But Sorel did not fully align with all aspects of fascism. Initially, he was quite impressed by Mussolini and his accomplishments. Intriguingly, following World War I, Sorel concluded that Vladimir Lenin, rather than Mussolini, was the true embodiment of his ideals. So, it seems we are again at a sort of dead end here. There does seem to be a challenge in establishing a unifying philosophical foundation for fascism due to A, the absence of a singular universally acknowledged father of fascism akin to other ideologies, and B, the unique development of fascism in each nation, both as a movement and in terms of its underlying intellectual basis. Oswald Mosley addresses this complexity in his book Fascism 100 Questions Asked and Answered. Specifically, when asked about the distinctions between British fascism and the fascism of Italy and Germany, he responded as follows, quote, "The main difference is that they are Italian or German and that we are British. From this, all other differences follow. Fascism in essence is a national creed finding a different national expression and method in each nation. For this reason, fascist movements in each country vary more than socialist or communist movements, which are international. All great movements have been common to the world as a whole, both political and religious. All the old parties have their foreign counterparts. Liberalism, for instance, deluged the continent with blood, but came to Great Britain by British methods characteristic of this nation's ordered greatness. In this respect, we do what our forefathers did before us. We seek to bring the creed of our age to Great Britain by British methods in accord with British character. We seek also to emulate their example by finding for the creed of our age its highest expression and development in these islands. The British have not always originated the creed of the age, but they have usually perfected it. We claim that the policy of fascism in Britain goes far beyond any continental analogy in constructive conception. But, and here is the big but, despite the absence of a singular foundational figure for fascism, there is a core doctrine, a unifying belief that pervades all its variations. Oxford political theorist Roger Griffin identifies this doctrine as the distinguishing feature of fascism, setting it apart from all other authoritarian and nationalist ideologies. He refers to this as the fascist minimum, essential for the existence of true fascism, and that is Palingenetic ultranationalism. According to Roger Griffin, this is his simplest and most easily digestible definition of fascism from all his research. Quote, "Fascism is a political ideology whose mythic core in its various permutations is a palingenetic form of populist ultranationalism." Roger Griffin highlights three pivotal concepts: ultranationalism, populism, and palingenesis. An examination of fascist literature across a broad spectrum, from the United Kingdom to Romania, reveals the presence of these three principles in the foundational texts, propaganda, and policy frameworks of fascist movements, including those that did not achieve their objectives during the interwar and post-war periods. Let us explore these concepts further. Ultranationalism. This term can be very vague and can have a lot of nuance. It is of course recognized as a more radical form of nationalism, but that is about it. In the fascist sense, this form of nationalism is inherently rooted in anti-liberalism and anti-parliamentarism, distinguishing it from patriotic expressions by figures like de Gaulle, Margaret Thatcher, Boris Yeltsin, and so forth. It is meant to encompass a wide array of ethnocentrism stemming from the inherent complexities of what defines a nation and the various ways racism can manifest as a sophisticated form of xenophobia. Due to this inherent flexibility, in fascism, ultranationalism can include different ideas depending on the nation, the Italian race for Italy, the Aryan race for Germany, or even a broader concept of European nationalism, which emphasizes ethnic communities over nation-states as the foundation of a vibrant culture. Ultranationalism also covers the biologically determined racism seen in Nazism and other movements across Europe, and this is where the primary argument of the idea that National Socialism isn't fascism comes from, that Nazism is more racist rather than nationalist. But this argument fails to mention that, for the Nazis, the concepts of the German nation and race were essentially the same. Furthermore, ignoring the significance of nationalism to ordinary Germans in the Nazi regime's social engineering is more of a matter of denial than misunderstanding. Populism is also a term often described as too vague, but in this case it should specifically be used without historical connotations. It should capture this idea of quote-unquote people power that arises when the masses are mobilized by mythic energies, whether spontaneously or artificially. It is also a fact that, unlike other populist ideologies, fascism is not against the concept of hierarchies. If anything, it actually approves of them. So naturally, a lot of people conclude that this inherently clashes with the populist sentiments of fascism, citing it as a contradiction. But this supposed contradiction turns into a paradox when you consider the fact that the ideal nation fascists are trying to build is inherently anti-egalitarian. The revolutionary awakening is envisioned to involve the whole people, or at least those considered healthy members of it, rather than a specific class or group. But given the nation's current degraded state, the majority are seen as asleep, influenced by quote-unquote alien values, necessitating a vanguard to spread division and seize power. In the new envisioned regime, this vanguard becomes the new elite, chosen not for their class, power, or wealth, but for their dedication to the new national order and their usefulness in achieving it. Thus, fascism's view of the masses is deeply ambivalent, seeing them as both gullible and potential heroes. To put it simply, the fascist elite is in stark contrast with the modern notion of an elite. In fascism, the elite is not defined by traditional class structures, wealth or power, but by their dedication to the ideology and the envisioned ideal state. This elite is seen as a vanguard that leads and awakens the masses to the fascist cause. Think of it like this: normal elites want to keep the people ignorant, and they always set up a barrier between them and the quote-unquote commoners, and do everything in their power to keep this barrier up and control the masses. Fascist elites, on the other hand, using their position of power, are not charged with defending the barrier, but rather breaking it and enlightening the masses towards their cause. This is why, at least according to fascism, a hierarchy and elite can and should exist within the populist framework. And finally, we come to the last and definitely the most important part for fascism: palingenesis, or in other words, rebirth. This real power behind fascism, which affects everything from its organization and style to its policies and ethics, is the idea that the nation can soon rise again from its current problems and decline, just like a phoenix, into a new and revolutionary political and cultural era that includes all the true members of the nation. It should be emphasized, however, that this rebirth within the fascist framework isn't reactionary or conservative, in the sense that the nation will be reborn by going back in the past. Instead, it refers to a new birth, incorporating timeless principles like the virtues of Rome, the Aryans, or the Anglo-Saxons into a modern society. Fascism values and looks to the past, but not as a means to return to it, but rather uses those old times of greatness as a blueprint upon which they would build an entirely new nation and society. This makes fascism both anti-reactionary and anti-conservative, despite the common misconception that fascism is some kind of reactionary belief, and because of this, each nation and its own rebirth will look differently. In fact, pretty much every fascist book you pick up will mention some form of rebirth and establishing a new nation. Let us go through a few of them to get some samples. Up first is Giovanni Gentile and Italy. In his essays on fascism, Gentile makes this very clear in Italy's case. Quote, "That Italy that we all carry in our hearts and which forms in fact the substance of our being and of our character, if we watch it intensely today, with a gaze made more acute by our desire for a more elevated and powerful national life, with a passion that we cherish within ourselves after the agony of defeat and the pride of victory in the Great War, that Italy presents itself to us in two manifestly different forms. We see two Italys before us, one old and the other new. There is the Italy of the ages which is our glory, but which is also our sad legacy, heavy on our shoulders and a burden to our spirits. It is a legacy which we must candidly admit is a disgrace of which we would be free, for which we must make amends." In the case of Romania, the leader of the Iron Guard, Corneliu Codreanu, shares his visions for a new Romania in his book For My Legionaries. Codreanu articulates a vision for Romania's rebirth through a transformative movement that is both national and spiritual. He discusses the establishment of the legionary movement, emphasizing the need for a moral and spiritual revival of the Romanian people, and eventually the birth of a new nation. Quote, "Let us all unite, men and women, to carve for ourselves and for our people another destiny. The hour of Romanian resurrection and deliverance is approaching. He who believes, he who will fight and suffer, will be rewarded and blessed by this people. New times knock at our gates. A world with an infertile and dry soul is dying, and another one is being born, belonging to those who are full of faith. In this new world, everyone will have his place, not based on his schooling, intelligence, or knowledge, but above all, in accordance with his faith and character." Then we have José Antonio Primo de Rivera and his Falange movement in Spain. In his speeches and writings, de Rivera envisions a transformative rebirth and revolution for Spain, emphasizing the need for unity, social justice, and a collective national mission. Quote, "That is why we stand alone, because we see that there has got to be a new Spain created, a Spain that can escape from the double grip of hatred and fear by the only way out that is decent and noble, and that is upwards. That is why our slogan, Up with Spain, has now become more prophetic than ever. We seek an upward way of escape for a Spain once more capable of wholly providing her people with three things our slogan proclaims: Patria, bread, and justice. Spain needs her revolution. Spain needs a revolution that shall give her back the sense of having something to do in the world and establish her upon an endurable social foundation. The Spanish social foundation is soaked and riddled with injustice. A great part of the Spanish people are still living at the level of the beasts. The Spanish country needs a complete reorganization of its economy. It needs an entirely new social sense, and it needs to feel united in a collective mission to be accomplished. Oswald Mosley also said something similar in his book The Greater Britain, where he makes it very clear that the Blackshirt mission in the United Kingdom was the establishment of a whole new civilization. Quote, "The task before us is nothing less than the creation of a new civilization. This is an enterprise which must begin with a new spirit in man, for until man himself is remade, it is vain to hope for any fundamental improvement in his material environment. The old parties neither can adopt nor can they imitate the spirit of fascism, which is essential to a revival in the spirit of man and is therefore the prerequisite of any real revival in his material environment." We move forward to a predestined triumph, for we carry with us the hopes of youth and the wisdom of age in the service of the greatest of all creeds, the creed of the modern world. This is not a question of policy, it is a question of spirit. That spirit lives. It will guide us to the rebirth of Britain and to the establishment of the Greater Britain. I could go on, but you get the point already. Palingenesis is found in pretty much every fascist movement, and is always a core doctrine. The belief that the nation is degrading and falling apart, and that only a rebirth, the establishment of an entirely new society, can save the country, just like a phoenix rising from the ashes. But Mosley said something interesting in his part, and that is this remake of man himself and the new spirit. And this is where the fascist quote-unquote revolution finally comes in. It is evident to us all that fascism fundamentally embodies a revolutionary ideal. In my previous video, I briefly explored the notion of the fascist revolution. I noted that, although fascists promote the idea of a revolution, they seldom fully execute it. Upon gaining power, they often moderate and diminish their rhetoric. Thus, I concluded that this revolutionary side of fascism was nothing more than a bluff, meant to rile people up in the very beginning. However, I overlooked a critical aspect in that video. While discussing the fascist revolution, I consistently viewed it through the lens of a typical socio-economic revolution, given that revolution is often the ultimate aim of many revolutionary ideologies. The distinctive factor here is that fascists do not pursue a socio-economic revolution per se. Rather, such a revolution is merely a tool. Their true aspiration and ultimate objective is the revolution of the soul. Even Robert Paxton in his book, which comes to a completely different conclusion on fascism compared to Griffin, noticed this, quote, "Despite their frequent talk about revolution, fascists did not want a socio-economic revolution. They wanted a revolution of the soul and a revolution in the world position of their people. They meant to unify and invigorate and empower their decadent nation, to reassert the prestige of Romanita, the German folk, or Hungarism or other group destiny. For that purpose, they believed they needed armies, productive capacity, order, and property, force their country's traditional productive elements into subjection, perhaps transform them, no doubt, but not abolish them." So how exactly does this spiritual revolution look like? While it differs from one country to another, the overarching concept of the fascist quote-unquote new man underscores the significance of moral and spiritual rejuvenation in crafting a cohesive national identity. This new man would reject the decadent notions of individualism and materialism, opting instead for a collective national ethos. Ultimately, this leads to the individual's identity becoming indistinguishably fused with that of the nation. This is why Giovanni Gentile wrote, quote, "For fascism, the state and the individual are one, or better perhaps, state and individual are terms that are inseparable in a necessary synthesis." The spiritual revolution involves a resurgence of idealism, concentrating on duty, sacrifice, and a shared objective. This embodies the authentic revolution fascism seeks to accomplish, not merely altering the administration of the state, but transforming the very essence of society and its inhabitants. Again, I will quote Mosley on this issue, quote, "Fascism is a creed of the age of science and of the machine. It is essentially the conception of a new order suited to the new conditions which science and the machine have made. It is the creed of the age of organization and of immensely augmented power which organization brings. It is essentially idealistic, and its root principle is service of the nation, in a spirit which is not one of personal ambition or of class or sectional interest, but of devotion to the national welfare beyond all personal advantage. It is in this spirit the great fascist movement has arisen in every country." As noted earlier, fascism lacks a central figure or philosopher that adherents universally regard, unlike many traditional ideologies. This is precisely because it is not an international ideology, in contrast to theories such as socialism or liberalism. Consequently, providing a precise definition becomes challenging, as it cannot be directly attributed to a singular founding figure, so to speak. Nevertheless, three critical concepts are inherent in every variant of fascism: ultranationalism, populism, and most notably, palingenesis. These three principles constitute the foundation of every fascist ideology. Without them, true fascism cannot exist. All other divergent notions, such as social policies, imperialism, and controlled economics, are secondary and differ from country to country. While these aspects are indeed significant, they do not form the essence of the ideology. I do believe Roger Griffin's thesis on palingenetic ultranationalism is the most accurate way to describe and define fascism, since all the dots pretty much line up. Although, I would argue that his final definition is a bit short, perhaps a bit vague. So, I want to end this video with my personal and preferred definition of fascism, after everything I have learned. Quote, "Fascism is revolutionary nationalism rooted in an organic worldview with the unifying palingenetic myth of the new man and national rebirth. It is built on social capital and is a grassroots populist struggle of the people against the forces of international finance and the spiritual decadence of materialism."